He gets up without thinking twice, offers his seat, and simply goes back to looking at his cell phone. You'd be surprised to know what happened in just 3 minutes. Fate would never be the same again. It was a hot Thursday afternoon, and João, a 16-year-old black boy, was on the crowded bus on his way home. As usual, he was immersed in his world, playing games on his cell phone, trying to forget the difficulties of the day. But at that moment, something caught his eye. An elderly woman got on the bus, frail and tired-looking, and people simply ignored her, until he, without hesitation, stood up and offered his seat. He didn't know it, but that simple gesture would change his life forever. João had always known that his life wouldn't be easy. He grew up in a lower-class neighborhood, where people struggled to survive and where dreams were often a luxury that few could afford. The weight of reality was a constant in his life. From an early age, he learned that the world was not a kind place, and that kindness often went unrewarded. Living in a neighborhood where violence, lack of opportunities, and poverty were palpable made him accustomed to indifference. He knew what it was like to go through difficulties and receive no help from anyone. It was not uncommon to see people moving away from each other, everyone fighting for their own survival without looking around. At school, he rarely stood out, not because he didn't have the ability, but because he had always been the kind of boy who preferred to stay quiet, observe, and go unnoticed. He didn't want to be noticed too much because he knew how dangerous that could be. But there was something that made him believe that he wasn't totally lost. João never lost his compassion. Even in a hostile environment, he believed that kindness still had some value. He saw others around and closing in, but he couldn't help but care. Even though he didn't have much, he always tried to do something for someone when he could, even if it was a simple gesture, like holding the door for someone to walk through or helping a classmate with their homework. Deep down, he believed that kindness could be the key to a better world, although he knew that this belief was often difficult to sustain. Life was never easy for João, but he always stood firm in his morals. He knew that, despite the difficulties, he had something that set him apart: his humanity. It was precisely this sense of humanity that led him to give up his seat to that lady on the bus. At that moment, he didn't think about the difficulties he was facing or how tiring his day was. He simply did what he felt was right. He knew that if he were her, he would want to be treated with the same respect, with the same kindness. The lady looked exhausted, her steps slow, her posture bent by age and the weight of the battles that life had imposed on her. Although most people ignored her, João could not remain indifferent. He stood up and offered her his seat without hesitation, a simple gesture, but full of empathy. For him, it was just what anyone would do, an act of respect and dignity. However, soon after the gesture, a strange sensation began to take hold of João. He felt as if something important was about to happen, but he didn't know what. He wasn't used to being so impulsive, especially in a place like this, where caution was the rule. Something inside him told him that this lady was no ordinary person, but he didn't know why. He tried to push the thought from his mind, refocusing on his cell phone and trying to forget the worries of the day. But at the same time, a growing curiosity formed inside him, as if a door had opened and he could no longer ignore what was on the other side. He didn't know it, but her gesture of kindness was about to throw his life into a whirlwind of uncertainty. At that moment, he didn't know what was coming. Little did he know that he was being tested, that his destiny was about to change in a way he would never have imagined. He thought that, after that simple gesture of kindness, he would return home and continue his life as usual. However, life has a very peculiar way of teaching us that our actions, even the simplest ones, can have far greater repercussions than we imagine. What seemed like an ordinary afternoon was about to become the milestone of a major transformation. As the bus made its way through the streets, João felt a little more relieved to have done something good, but the feeling of unease persisted. He looked at the lady still sitting with a tired expression, but something in her eyes seemed different. She was calmer, as if that gesture had done more for her than any words could express. For a moment, João wondered what she might be thinking, but quickly dismissed the idea. After all, she was there resting, without any expression of surprise, as if it were the most normal thing in the world for someone to get up and offer her a seat. And to João, it made sense. It was simple and human, but he couldn't stop thinking about that lady. Something about her caught his attention, something he couldn't define. And it was then, almost at the end of the journey, that the lady looked at him with a gaze that seemed to pierce his soul. Without saying a word, she got up and approached him, taking something from her handbag pocket and placing it in his hands. It was a small piece of folded paper. When she did this, John's world stopped for a moment. He stared at the note, perplexed, not knowing what to do. She returned to her seat without saying a word, but João sensed that this was more than just a note. It was something important. He knew something big was happening, but he had no idea what was coming. He put the note in his pocket, not knowing what it meant, but something inside him told him that he needed to know. And at that very moment, John's life was about to change in a way he could never have predicted. He didn't know it, but what seemed like a simple act of kindness was about to reveal a secret he would never have imagined. When the bus finally stopped and João got off, he still had the ticket in his pocket, but something inside him was different. It wasn't just the simple gesture of giving up his seat to that lady that was occupying his thoughts. Something bigger was at stake. He felt a strange sensation that, for some reason, that note was going to change everything. His instinct told him that this was no accident. It never had been, but he couldn't understand why. The simple crumpled piece of paper in his hands seemed to carry a much greater emotional weight than he had imagined, as if somehow it were a sign. He didn't know what to expect or how to act in that situation, but an inexplicable force made him want to understand what was happening. When he got home, his eyes tired and his mind overloaded, João sat on the edge of the bed. The noisy and chaotic streets of his city were still fresh in his memory, but his heart was beating faster for a reason he couldn't explain. The note was there, folded and plain, like a little puzzle waiting to be solved. Without further ado, he opened it. The words on it were not what he had expected. Instead of something trivial or ordinary, the note was filled with something that seemed unusual, something profound. It was a simple but powerful message that made John's stomach turn. I know what you've done. I see what you have inside you. You can change your life. The key is in your hands. These words, in careful, precise handwriting, made his body freeze. He read and reread, trying to process what those words meant. He couldn't understand, but he felt a growing anxiety take hold of him. Who was that lady? What did she know about him? How could she know what was inside him if they barely knew each other? He had heard of people who seemed to have some kind of sixth sense, but it seemed surreal, something that only happened in movies or in stories people told. But inside, he felt that something very real was afoot, something he couldn't ignore. He looked at the note again, feeling a pressure in his chest. It was an uncomfortable feeling, as if something was brewing, something he couldn't control. But at the same time, a sense of curiosity still drove him forward. He knew he had to understand what it meant. That note couldn't just be a coincidence. And as John's mind tried to process what was happening, a question arose strongly. How can this change my life? He knew he had to find an answer, not because he wanted or needed anything more in his life, but because he felt that somehow his own evolution depended on it. As the hours passed, the anxiety turned into a silent determination. João no longer felt the same. He could no longer just carry on as before. Something inside him was being activated, as if that note were a key, a building block for something bigger, something he couldn't see, but felt in every cell of his body. He knew that his meeting with the lady had not been an accident, and the note had only confirmed it. She knew something that he still didn't fully understand, but that somewhere in his heart, he was beginning to accept. His life could be different. He knew it could be different. But what exactly was he supposed to do with it? The next day, John found himself at a crossroads. The options before him were endless, but he didn't know which way to go. He didn't know whether to simply move on, ignoring the note and trying to get back to his routine, or whether to act on what those words suggested. But, as if on impulse, he found himself once again back where he started. He could no longer ignore the feeling that something bigger was at play. The change he felt in his heart was not something simple. He wasn't sure what he would do, but he knew he had to make a decision. Life would never be the same again. Something was calling to him, something he didn't fully understand, but which he somehow knew he had to follow. And so, with a note still in his hand, he began to ask questions. Who was that lady? What did she know about him? What did that key mention in the note mean? He had no answers, but at the same time, he knew he was getting close to something important. And more than that, he knew that the lady had made it clear that he had the ability to change his own life. He didn't know how yet, but he felt that the key was really in his hands. Deep down, something inside him told him that this wasn't just a simple gesture of kindness, a clue to something much bigger. He could choose to ignore it and carry on with life as he always had, or he could take the next step toward something he didn't yet fully understand, but which he was already feeling deep down in his soul. Every second that passed, he felt he was getting closer to the truth, closer to understanding what it all meant. He didn't know what he would find at the end of this journey, but something inside him was being awakened, something that made him believe that his life was about to change forever. And with a note in his hands, he knew he could no longer turn back. The days following that meeting dragged on strangely, as if time was dragging on, challenging John's patience. He couldn't get the note out of his head. His mind was restless with a whirlwind of thoughts. Every time he looked at the paper, an overwhelming sense of urgency came over him, as if he had been summoned to something big and his instinct was pushing him to act. But what was he supposed to do with it? How could he take the first step? It was clear that something inside him had changed, but he didn't know where to start. It was then, on that hot, muggy afternoon, that things began to unravel. John, exhausted from torturing himself with questions he had no answers to, decided to go for a walk. Perhaps some fresh air would help clear his mind. He walked through the streets of his city, the same streets he knew so well, but now with a new perception. He felt as if everything had changed, as if an invisible fog hung over him, but no one else seemed to notice. He wondered if things would ever go back to normal, or if he was about to embark on something he couldn't even imagine. But, as if fate had aligned itself perfectly for him, the answer came. As he crossed the town's central square, something familiar caught his eye. It was a small newsstand, and there she was, the lady. The same lady he had helped on the bus. She was standing there, looking at the magazines, seemingly oblivious to everything around her. Her white hair was now tied up in a tight bun, and she looked more fragile than before. João hesitated for a moment, the ticket still clutched in his hand, and before he could make a conscious decision, his feet had already taken him to her. The lady looked at him for a moment, and before he could say anything, she smiled, as if waiting for him. "You're wondering what to do with this, aren't you?" she said, her voice calm but with a depth that seemed to cut through the space between them. John, completely speechless, shook his head slowly. How did she know? How could she know what he was thinking, what he was feeling? He was speechless, not knowing what to say or how to react. That moment felt like some kind of test, something that challenged all his notions of what was real and what wasn't. "I knew you'd come back. I always knew," she continued, her voice soft and filled with a disconcerting confidence. "You have within you a capacity for transformation that you don't yet understand. This note is just the beginning. The real challenge lies in recognizing your own strength." Her name, she knew his name. Something inside João shuddered. He no longer knew if this was really happening or if he was having some kind of nightmare. But something inside him pushed him to continue, to listen, to understand. The lady then made a gesture, as if she wanted him to come closer. And even though his heart was beating faster by the second, he approached her with a mixture of fear and the need to understand. What would she say next? What did she know that he didn't? With her eyes fixed on him, she took his hands in hers and said, "You were chosen, João, not by chance. The key to your true freedom is in your hands. It's not about money. It's not about status or fame. It's about who you are, the courage you have to look inwards and find the strength to be more than you are now. Life has given you that chance. The real question is, what are you going to do with it? These words, spoken with such certainty and power, washed over John like an immense wave. He felt as if something inside him had been unlocked, as if the walls he had built up over the years were coming down all at once. He knew what she was saying. He knew deep in his heart that she wasn't talking about something superficial, but something profound, something he had ignored for so long, the power to transform. He felt, for the first time, that the chains that bound him were breaking. Something in his soul was awakening, an intense flame that he hadn't known existed inside him. With a deep sigh, João felt completely vulnerable, but also free in a way he had never experienced before. The lady's words kept reverberating in his mind, and he realized that everything he had ever wanted was within his reach. It was no longer a question of luck or fate. It was a question of courage. The courage to make the right choice. The courage to look inwards and take charge of his own life. He knew he was on the threshold of a major change, but now he knew what he needed to do. He had the key, and it was no longer a question of waiting for the right moment. The moment was now. She looked deeply into his eyes and, as if sensing the transformation taking place inside him, smiled with a gleam of satisfaction. Now go. The world is waiting for you. The lady's words echoed in his mind as he slowly walked away. What he had just experienced was not something he could ignore. He now had a mission. He could no longer hide from himself, nor ignore the potential he now knew he possessed. There were no more excuses. The time for waiting was over. John was never the same after that day. What seemed like a simple gesture of kindness turned into something much bigger. Not only did he give up his seat to a lady on the bus, but in doing so, he opened a door to a new version of himself that he didn't even know existed. The note, which at first appeared to be a simple message, turned out to be an invitation to something deeper, a journey of self-knowledge and transformation. In the days that followed, he began to ask himself more questions about who he really was, what he wanted, and what the true purpose of his life was. The lady's words constantly resonated in his mind. The key to your true freedom is in your hands. He could no longer ignore the truth that had revealed itself to him at that moment. He could no longer run away from the need to face himself and seek the greatness that he had always known was within him, but which had been lost over time. The change wasn't instantaneous, of course. It wouldn't be easy. But something inside John was different. He knew that if he wanted to become the person he had always had the potential to be, he needed to take action. And little by little, John began to take charge of his life. He began to make bolder decisions, to move away from influences that limited him, and to seek a future with more purpose. What began as a simple gesture of kindness turned into an internal revolution. He understood that opportunities for change were always around him, but real change would only happen when he began to truly believe in his own strength. And so John got up every day with a new mission. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he was ready to face it. Because, in the end, what he learned that day on the bus wasn't just about being kind to others. It was about being kind to himself, making room for his own evolution, and understanding that true freedom begins when you decide to believe in the power you have within yourself. Just for those of you who like a good story and have watched to the end, leave your comment below from which city you're watching, and I'll leave a heart in your comment. Bye, and see you in the next video.